The roar of Air Force One was the last thing Sarah Mitchell expected in her quiet town, until it changed everything. She was bent over the engine of an old pickup truck, her hands steady and skilled, as if they carried the memory of every vehicle she had ever touched. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty floor of her small garage, a place where silence usually reigned, broken only by the occasional clang of metal or the hiss of compressed air. Sarah had lived in this town for years, a place too small for distractions where everyone knew everyone else's business. But she kept her own story locked away, like the grease-stained coveralls she wore every day. Few people knew she had once been a mechanic for the Air Force, a young woman who had fought to prove herself in a world dominated by men, who had fixed helicopters in the middle of a desert storm, where lives depended on her precision. Now she fixed cars, quietly, no crowds, no expectations. The sound in the sky grew louder, a deep rumble that shook the windows and rattled the tools on the bench. Sarah straightened up and wiped her hands on a rag, glancing out the open garage door just as a massive jet cast its long shadow across the main street of the town. Air Force One was coming in for a landing, a rare and unexpected event that turned heads and stilled conversations. Sarah's heart tightened. The last time she had seen anything like this was years ago, on a tarmac far from here, surrounded by noise and tension, with the weight of a mission pressing down on her. But here, in this small town, the powerful symbol of the president's plane seemed out of place, like a sudden thunderstorm on a clear day. She didn't move to join the crowd that had gathered along the roadside. Instead, she stayed in her garage, her gaze fixed on the plane descending slowly, its engines roaring like thunder in the quiet afternoon. The town's usual calm was shattered, and with it, something inside Sarah began to stir. She thought of her father, General Mitchell, a man whose name was known across military bases and history books alike. He had served during the Cold War, a legend in his own right, and the source of a silence between them that had lasted far too long. Sarah had chosen a different path, one away from medals and speeches into grease and engines. But no matter how far she ran, the past had a way of catching up. The convoy vehicles escorting the president's plane rolled slowly down the road, their engines humming a low warning. Among them was a military jeep suddenly grinding to a halt, a sharp hiss of air and then silence. The crowd gasped. The convoy had stalled. Within moments, officers jumped out and approached Sarah's garage, their faces tight with worry. They had heard of the woman who fixed anything with wheels, a mechanic with a military past who rarely spoke but was known for getting the job done. Time was running out, and the president's arrival depended on that jeep moving again. Sarah wiped her hands again and nodded. Without hesitation, she followed the officers to the vehicle, her boots kicking up dust on the road. The hood was already open, exposing a complex engine that even some military mechanics might hesitate to touch. But Sarah didn't flinch. She knelt down and began inspecting the problem, her fingers running over parts as if recalling a familiar friend. The pressure was immense. Air Force One was minutes from landing, and every second mattered. She could feel the weight of the town's eyes on her, the silent hope that she would fix this, and fast. As she worked, memories flooded back, dust storms in Iraq, explosions echoing in the distance, the tense moments of repairing a helicopter under fire. Back then, failure meant death. Now failure meant embarrassment for a town and a delayed presidential visit. But the stakes felt just as high. Her hands moved quickly and confidently, pulling out tools, tightening bolts, checking connections. Sweat ran down her brow, mixing with the grease on her skin. The sun dipped lower, casting an orange glow that seemed to set the whole world on fire. Finally, with a grunt of effort, she turned the key. The Jeep's engine roared to life, steady and strong. Relief swept through the crowd like a wave. The officers nodded, offering quick thanks before climbing back in. Sarah stepped back, breathing hard but steady. She watched the convoy move forward again, the path cleared just in time. The distant thunder of Air Force One's engines grew louder once more, signaling the plane's imminent arrival. For a moment, the crowd around her broke into applause, but Sarah said nothing. She turned back toward her garage, the silence settling once more like a familiar cloak. Yet inside, something had shifted. The roar of that plane, the urgent call for help, it had reminded her who she was and what she was capable of. Air Force One touched down smoothly, the massive jet slowing as it rolled to a stop near the runway. The president's visit was back on schedule. But for Sarah Mitchell, the day was far from over. The quiet mechanic who fixed cars in silence had just stepped back into a world she thought she'd left behind, and it was about to change everything. As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, Sarah looked out from her garage one last time. The engines had stopped roaring, but the echo lingered in her heart. This was more than a broken Jeep or a delayed visit. It was a call to something bigger, and she was ready to answer. Behind every wrench Sarah turned lay a father's legacy she never asked for, and a silence heavier than any engine. She carried his name, but not his pride. General Mitchell was a man of rigid discipline and high expectations, a decorated veteran of the Cold War whose face had been etched into history books and military walls alike. To the world, he was a hero. To Sarah, he was a constant reminder of battles fought both abroad and at home. As a child, Sarah had tried to follow in his footsteps. She wore the crisp uniforms, studied military history, and dreamed of serving her country with the same honor. But she soon discovered that her path was different. While her father commanded armies and planned strategies, Sarah found her battlefield under hoods and between gears. Her hands were meant to fix machines, not lead troops. That difference became a quiet wedge between them. Family dinners were filled with unspoken words and distant glances. Her father's stern gaze often lingered on her like a question with no answer. Why wasn't she the daughter he expected? Why did she prefer grease to metals? Sarah learned to keep her thoughts and feelings locked away, finding solace in the steady rhythm of engines rather than the loud clangor of military life. Her mother had tried to bridge the gap, encouraging Sarah to find her own way, but the weight of General Mitchell's shadow was too large. He rarely spoke of emotions or regrets. The Cold War had taught him to be strong, silent, and unyielding, and he expected nothing less from his family. Yet beneath his tough exterior, there was a complex man shaped by decades of conflict and sacrifice. Sarah had glimpsed that once during a rare visit home. She found him alone in his study, staring at a faded photograph of soldiers long gone. For a moment, the general seemed less like a legend and more like a father struggling with ghosts. Sarah's decision to join the Air Force was met with mixed feelings. Her father was proud but cautious. He admired her determination, but worried about the dangers she would face as a young woman in a male-dominated force. She had to prove herself every day, not just to her superiors, but to her own family. Boot camp was brutal, but Sarah thrived on the challenge. The clanging of boots, the barked orders, the endless drills, they all pushed her to be stronger. She earned respect through skill and grit, mastering aircraft maintenance with precision. In the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, she worked in dangerous conditions, repairing helicopters under fire, saving lives through her quiet expertise. Letters home were sparse, often delayed and filled with little more than practical updates. She rarely spoke of the battles or the fear, choosing instead to focus on the work that kept her alive. The silence was mutual. Her father's messages were formal and brief, carrying the weight of a general who struggled to express affection. When Sarah returned home from deployment, she was different. The war had left marks that no medal could erase. She found it hard to reconnect with her father and harder still to explain the things she had seen and done. The garage became her sanctuary, a place where she could be herself without judgment. Over time, Sarah's reputation grew, not just in town, but among military circles. They knew her as the quiet mechanic who could fix anything, a woman who refused to be defined by her gender or her family name. But she remained distant from her father's world, a world of strategy rooms, ceremonies, and politics. Her father's health had begun to decline, and there were whispers among the military community that the great general was slowing down. Sarah wrestled with a mix of emotions, regret for lost time, a desire to reconcile, and the knowledge that some wounds might never fully heal. Then came the news that Air Force One would land near her town, a rare event bringing the military back into her quiet life. It was as if fate had given her a chance to bridge the gap between past and present, between daughter and father. As the plane descended, Sarah's thoughts turned to the man she hadn't seen in years. Would he recognize the woman she had become? Could they find common ground in the shared language of service and sacrifice? The arrival of the convoy's broken jeep was the first sign that her world and her father's were about to collide. When the officers brought the vehicle to her, it wasn't just a call for help. It was a test of her skills, her courage, and her place in a legacy she had long avoided. Sarah worked quickly, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Fixing the engine was more than a mechanical task. It was a step toward reclaiming her own identity and proving her worth beyond the silence that had defined her family. When the job was done and the convoy rolled on, Sarah looked up to see her father standing nearby. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The general's eyes held a mixture of surprise, pride, and something deeper, an unspoken apology and a hope for forgiveness. The years of distance between them suddenly felt fragile, like a thin thread waiting to be rewoven. In that moment, Sarah realized that courage was not just about facing enemies abroad, but also about confronting the silent battles at home. Her father's presence by Air Force One was more than a ceremony. It was a chance for a new beginning. A chance for a daughter and her father to find their way back to each other, through the shared language of service, sacrifice, and unspoken love. Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The silence might never fully disappear. But as she stood there, watching the plane prepare to depart, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that her story, and their story, was far from over. The convoy rolled steadily along the narrow, winding road that led to the small airstrip just outside town. Soldiers in crisp uniforms sat tense inside the armored vehicles, eyes scanning the horizon. Their mission was simple, but critical: ensure the president's safe arrival and departure. But the peaceful afternoon was about to be shattered by a problem no one expected. Suddenly, one of the lead vehicles, a sleek military jeep tasked with reconnaissance and communications, stuttered, then jerked to a stop. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence followed, thick and heavy, broken only by the low hum of distant planes overhead. The jeep was dead in the water, and the convoy was now vulnerable. The commanding officer barked orders, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get that vehicle moving! We can't delay the president's arrival." Soldiers scrambled out, their boots pounding against the cracked asphalt. Radio chatter buzzed with frustration and concern. The convoy was at a standstill, and time was slipping away. Every minute counted. If the jeep wasn't fixed quickly, the entire operation would be thrown into chaos. The president's schedule was tight, security protocols unyielding, and the eyes of the nation and world were watching. Someone remembered the mechanic in town, Sarah Mitchell. A quiet woman, known only in hushed tones within military circles for her skill and speed. The same woman who had once worked in the Air Force, fixing helicopters in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Now, she was the town's best-kept secret. An officer's face hardened with determination as he approached Sarah's garage. The others followed, hopeful but uncertain. When Sarah looked up from under the hood of an old pickup, she saw the tension etched on their faces. Without hesitation, she closed the hood and wiped her hands on a rag. The moment was already heavy with pressure. The broken Jeep was pushed into her garage, tires kicking up dust. The engine was silent but told a story of sudden failure. Sarah dropped to her knees, pulling out her tools. She didn't waste a second scanning the engine, her fingers deftly probing wires and parts. The air smelled of oil, gasoline, and the faint trace of sweat from years of hard work. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with focus. She recalled similar breakdowns from her deployments: desert dust clogging air filters, overheating engines, faulty fuel pumps. But this was different. The Jeep was modern and complex, a machine built for war, not the quiet roads of her town. The clock was unforgiving. She could hear the distant drone of Air Force One growing louder as it approached. She needed to work fast. Any idea what happened? One of the soldiers asked, leaning in cautiously. Sarah didn't look up. Could be fuel line blockage or an electrical short, she said, her voice low but steady. Give me a minute. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Her hands moved with practiced ease, unscrewing panels, testing circuits, replacing parts scavenged from her own collection of military-grade tools. Every move was precise. No room for mistakes. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the past. The endless days under blistering sun and freezing nights, repairing choppers while gunfire echoed nearby. The faces of comrades flashed in her mind. Some lost to missions she had helped keep alive. She swallowed hard and refocused on the task. Suddenly, she hit upon the culprit, a snapped fuel line hidden beneath a protective casing. It was small but critical. She worked quickly, pulling out a spare line from her toolbox. The soldiers watched in silence, the tension palpable. With the repair done, Sarah gave the mechanic's nod, a simple gesture that meant everything. She climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and held her breath. The engine roared back to life, steady and strong. Relief swept across the faces around her like a wave. Good work, the officer said, a rare smile breaking through his military sternness. You saved the day. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow, her heart pounding with adrenaline. She felt the familiar rush of accomplishment, the same surge that had driven her through countless missions. But this time it was different. The stakes were higher, not just for the president, but for her own sense of belonging. As the convoy rolled forward, she stepped back into the fading light of the afternoon, her eyes catching the distant silhouette of Air Force One. The massive plane was now inches from touching down, its engines roaring like thunder. The crowd that had gathered along the roadside erupted into cheers. Sarah heard whispers, respectful, amazed. Some nodded in acknowledgement. Others stared, surprised to see her there. For a brief moment, she felt like she was part of something bigger, a silent hero in the backdrop of history. The convoy disappeared toward the runway, the president's arrival on schedule once more. The tension eased, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The day was far from over. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, Sarah's thoughts turned inward. She had stepped out of the shadows, but the path ahead was uncertain. What came next? Would she be drawn back into the world she had left behind, or remain in the quiet life she had built? Her hands, still stained with grease, trembled slightly, not from fear but from the rush of a life interrupted. The silence she cherished had been broken, and somewhere deep inside, she realized she was ready to listen. The roar of Air Force One faded into the distance, but its echo lingered, calling Sarah toward a mission she could no longer ignore. Every second was a countdown, not just for the engine, but for Sarah's own battle with the past. The moment she knelt beside the broken Jeep, the weight of years crashed down on her like a desert storm. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, but her mind raced through memories she had tried to bury, memories of sand, gunfire, and the relentless heat of distant wars. She remembered the early mornings in Iraq, the red sun rising over endless dunes, painting the sky in blood and fire. The hum of helicopters was a constant backdrop, a fragile thread between life and death. Sarah had been part of a crew tasked with keeping those machines alive, fixing rotor blades, engines, and electrical systems in the middle of chaos. She recalled one night in particular, the kind of night that never leaves you. A Black Hawk had taken a hit, a missile exploding too close, sending shrapnel ripping through metal and flesh. The pilot was alive but stranded in hostile territory. The clock was ticking, and Sarah's team had to repair a damaged helicopter under enemy fire. It was her hands that kept that bird in the air long enough to bring the pilot home. Now in the quiet garage of her small town, that same steady hand was at work. The Jeep's engine was complex but familiar, a puzzle she was determined to solve before the president's plane landed. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she traced wires, tightened bolts, and tested circuits. Every movement was a silent prayer that the machine would roar back to life. Outside, the world moved with urgency. Soldiers paced anxiously, glancing at their watches and then toward the horizon. The distant drone of Air Force One grew louder, a reminder that time was running out. Sarah's breath caught when she heard a faint click, the engine's first tentative growl. She smiled briefly, knowing the hardest part was over. But as she lifted the hood, a sudden jolt of pain shot through her wrist. She ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. The war had left scars, both visible and hidden, but she refused to let them slow her down. As the Jeep rumbled back to life, Sarah felt a flood of emotions, relief, pride, and something deeper. For years, she had carried the weight of silence, of sacrifices unspoken and battles fought alone. But this moment was different. She was part of a mission bigger than herself, a thread woven into the fabric of history. Her thoughts drifted to the comrades she had lost, faces burned into memory, names whispered in quiet moments. They had trusted her with their lives, and she had never let them down. Here now, fixing this Jeep under the watchful eyes of soldiers and civilians alike, she honored their memory. The convoy started moving again, engines humming in unison as they made their way to the airstrip. Sarah stood up slowly, her wrist aching but her spirit unbroken. The sun dipped low, casting a golden light over the scene, a stark contrast to the harsh environments she had faced before. A soldier approached, nodding respectfully. "You did good, ma'am." "Couldn't have done it without you," she nodded back, her voice quiet but firm. "It's what I was trained to do." As the convoy disappeared down the road, Sarah took a deep breath and turned toward her garage. The roar of Air Force One filled the air now, louder and more commanding. The plane's arrival marked a turning point, not just for the town, but for her own story. Inside the quiet of her workshop, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The grease on her hands, the smell of oil and metal, these were the constants in her life. They grounded her, reminded her of who she was beneath the layers of silence and solitude. Yet, beneath that steady exterior, a storm was brewing. The past she had long avoided was calling her back. The repair of the Jeep was more than a job. It was a signal that her skills, her courage, were still needed. That the woman who had fixed helicopters under fire was not forgotten. Her phone buzzed with messages from old contacts, invitations to reconnect, offers to help with upcoming missions. Sarah hesitated, the pull of duty mixing with the desire for peace. Could she balance the life she had built here with the call to serve again? The sounds of the plane's engines softened as Air Force One taxied to a stop on the runway. The president's arrival was imminent, and with it, the world's attention would turn to this quiet town, and to Sarah. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her face. The horizon glowed with the last light of day, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Hope that she could face the ghosts of her past, embrace the present, and find a future where her silence could finally speak. The battle was far from over, but Sarah Mitchell was ready. Not just to fix engines, but to fix the broken ties, to face the challenges ahead with the same grit and grace that had carried her through war and quiet alike. In the fading light, with the echo of engines behind her, Sarah took a step forward, toward a new mission, a new beginning, and the courage to write the next chapter of her story. The hangar doors at the small airstrip groaned open as the president's motorcade pulled into position. The crowd of townspeople gathered behind the barricades buzzed with anticipation, their faces lit by the late afternoon sun and the weight of an event rarely experienced here. Cameras clicked, flashes popped, and the unmistakable hum of military personnel filled the air. But Sarah stood apart, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures, silent, steady, and unmoved by the spectacle around her. She felt a knot tighten in her chest as the president stepped out of the sleek black limousine, flanked by Secret Service agents and high-ranking officers. The moment was charged, as if the air itself held its breath. This was no ordinary visit. For Sarah, it was a reckoning with her past, and perhaps a chance for reconciliation with the man who had always been just out of reach, her father. General Mitchell stood tall, Immaculate in his dress uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming like shards of a storied career. The years had softened his features but never dulled the intensity in his eyes. When their gazes met, the world around them seemed to blur. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with years of unspoken words and fractured hopes. Sarah forced herself to breathe steadily, recalling every lesson learned in the military. Control your emotions, stay focused, and never show weakness. But inside, a storm raged, a mixture of pride, regret, and longing. Her father, the man who had once been a towering figure of discipline and distance, was now standing mere feet away. Was this the moment to bridge the gap? Or would it only deepen the divide? The president approached, extending a hand toward Sarah. "I hear you're the woman who saved the convoy today," he said, his voice warm but commanding. "That's a remarkable feat. Thank you for your service." Sarah nodded, accepting the handshake with a quiet firmness. "Just doing my part, sir." The president's smile was brief but genuine. Sometimes the smallest acts have the biggest impact. Behind them, General Mitchell watched, his expression unreadable. When the president turned to greet him, Sarah took a step forward. "General," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt, "there's something I need to say." Her father's eyes narrowed and the crowd seemed to hush. The tension was palpable. Sarah swallowed hard and continued, "I've carried your legacy with me all these years, not as a burden, but as a challenge, to prove myself beyond the silence." The general's face softened ever so slightly. "Sarah," he replied, his voice low, "I have always known your strength. Maybe I just didn't know how to show it." The moment cracked the ice between them. The crowd around them shifted, sensing the rare and fragile connection. For years, their relationship had been defined by distance and duty. But now, beneath the glare of public attention, something real stirred. The president stepped back, allowing the two to speak privately. "There's more than one way to serve your country," General Mitchell said quietly. "You've done so with honor." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. The recognition she had long sought wasn't in medals or speeches, but in this simple acknowledgement. Later, as the ceremony continued, Sarah found herself alone near the edge of the runway. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The roar of Air Force One's engines filled the air again, ready for departure. A familiar voice called out behind her. "You did well today." She turned to see her father approaching, his uniform reflecting the last light of day. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said softly. "More than you know?" Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you, Dad." They stood together, two soldiers bound by blood and duty, facing the future with tentative hope. The past had shaped them both, its silence, its sacrifices, but the present offered a chance to rewrite their story. As Air Force One lifted off into the evening sky, Sarah felt a new chapter beginning, not just in her life, but in the legacy of a family who had finally found a way to speak beyond words. The small town that had once seemed so distant, from the world of power and war, now held a secret, a woman who had fixed more than engines. She had fixed broken ties, bridged generations, and found her place among the heroes whose stories often went untold. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Sarah Mitchell knew her journey was far from over. But this time, she wasn't alone. The days that followed the president's visit were heavy with a strange quiet, the kind that settles after a storm. The town returned to its usual rhythm, the distant hum of engines, the chatter of neighbors, the occasional rumble of a military convoy passing through. But for Sarah, the silence was different now. It was filled with questions, old memories, and the fragile hope that the cracks in her family's armor might finally heal. Sarah stood at the edge of her garage, watching the sun rise over the rolling hills. The morning light spilled over the dusty streets, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers reaching into her past. She thought about her father, the general whose stoic pride had both shaped and strained her life. Their brief conversation at the airstrip echoed in her mind. The simple words weighted with unspoken meaning. In the military, missions often ended with clear objectives, success or failure, victory or retreat. But life, Sarah was learning, was rarely so simple. Her phone buzzed, a message from an old friend in the Air Force. "We need you back. There's a new operation, something covert. You're the only one who can handle it." The invitation stirred a familiar fire inside her, a call to duty that she couldn't ignore, even if it meant leaving the quiet life she'd built. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. The war had taken so much already. Could she step back into that world? Would her father understand if she did? Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself at the local cafe, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the warm chatter of familiar faces. She ran her fingers over the worn wood table, thinking of the many times she had sat here, dreaming of a future beyond the town's borders. A figure approached, a man in plain clothes, his eyes sharp and steady. "Sarah Mitchell?" he asked quietly. She nodded, wary but curious. "I'm Captain Reyes," he said, flashing a badge discreetly. "We've been watching your work. You're exactly who we need for a critical mission. It's dangerous, covert, and it requires someone with your skills and discretion." Sarah's mind raced. Covert missions were a different beast. Silent wars fought in shadows, where mistakes meant more than failure. They meant death. "What kind of mission?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "There's been intel about a sabotage plot targeting a key military installation overseas. We need someone who can move quietly, repair and disable equipment, and blend in." "You're the perfect fit." Sarah thought of the broken Jeep, the convoy, the president's visit. Her skills had saved lives before, and now they were needed again. "I'm in," she said, determination flaring. The following days were a blur of preparation. Security briefings, equipment checks, and meetings with operatives who spoke in code and shadows. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She packed lightly, her hands steady as she gathered tools and gear, each piece a reminder of the life she was about to re-enter. Before leaving, she sought out her father. In his study, surrounded by photographs and medals, General Mitchell looked up as she entered. "You're going back," he said, his voice a mixture of pride and concern. "I have to," Sarah replied. "It's not just about fixing machines. It's about stopping something that could cost lives," he nodded slowly. "Be careful. And remember, courage isn't just about facing the enemy. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to ask for help." Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. For the first time, Sarah felt truly seen, not just as a daughter or a soldier, but as a woman with a mission. The night before her departure, Sarah sat on the porch of her childhood home, the cool breeze carrying memories of laughter, arguments, and long silences. She thought of the friends she was leaving behind, the small town that had shaped her, and the uncertain road ahead. As the stars emerged, bright and distant, she whispered a promise to herself, to her father, and to those who believed in her, that no matter where this mission took her, she would carry their strength with her. The dawn brought new challenges, new battles hidden beneath layers of secrecy. But Sarah Mitchell was ready, not just to fix what was broken, but to fight for a future where silence could be broken by courage, love, and sacrifice. And as the plane lifted off into the sky, she looked back one last time, knowing that this journey was far from over, but she was no longer alone. The night was thick with tension as Sarah stepped off the plane onto foreign soil, a place where shadows held secrets and every whisper could mean danger. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of dust, fuel, and something else, uncertainty. She adjusted the strap of her gear, her hands steady despite the adrenaline pounding in her veins. This was no ordinary mission. Failure was not an option. Her contact waited at the edge of the tarmac, a lean man with sharp eyes and a wary smile. "Welcome to the front lines of a silent war," he said quietly. "Everything here moves fast and in shadows. You'll need to trust no one but your instincts." Sarah nodded, the memories of past deployments flooding back, the desert heat, the crackle of radio chatter, the constant hum of helicopters overhead. But this mission was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about stopping a plot that could cripple military infrastructure and cost countless lives. They moved swiftly through the maze of hangars and warehouses, past soldiers who barely glanced their way. The facility was a hub of activity, planes, vehicles, and men and women preparing for operations that never made headlines. Sarah's mind raced with the details she'd been given, a sabotage plan targeting the fuel lines that powered the base's aircraft. If successful, it would ground the fleet, leaving the entire region vulnerable. Her task was clear: find the source of the sabotage, repair the damage, and prevent further attacks, all without alerting the enemy or raising suspicion. A delicate balance between mechanic, spy, and soldier. As she settled into the small quarters assigned to her, Sarah's phone buzzed, a coded message confirming the initial intelligence. The clock was ticking. The next morning, she donned her uniform and headed to the hangar where the damage was reported. The scene was worse than she imagined. Fuel lines slashed, equipment tampered with, and signs of forced entry. It was a calculated attack meant to cripple the base's operations. Sarah knelt beside the damaged fuel pipe, her fingers tracing the jagged cut. She pulled out her toolkit and got to work, her mind sharp, moving through the steps she had rehearsed countless times. But this was no simple repair. It was a race against time. While she worked, her eyes never stopped scanning for threats. Every noise, every shadow was a potential danger. She could feel eyes on her, but no one approached. The enemy was careful, watching from the darkness. Hours passed as she patched the pipe, reinforced the connections, and tested the system. Finally, fuel flowed smoothly once more. Relief washed over her, but there was no time to celebrate. Her contact appeared suddenly, urgency written across his face. "We've found something. The sabotage isn't over. There's a mole inside the base." Sarah's heart skipped. A traitor. Someone who knew their moves, their weaknesses. "We have to find them," she said, standing quickly. They moved through the base, quietly gathering information, questioning personnel under the guise of routine checks. Sarah's military training kicked in, observing body language, catching inconsistencies, piecing together fragments of a hidden story. Late that evening, in the dim light of the command center, the pieces fell into place. A junior technician, nervous and evasive, had access to sensitive areas and unexplained absences. The mole was closer than anyone thought. Sarah and her contact devised a plan, a trap to catch the saboteur in the act. It was risky, but the cost of failure was too high. The night deepened as Sarah hid in the shadows near the fuel storage. Every nerve screamed with anticipation. Suddenly, movement. A figure slipping toward the pipelines with a set of tools. She stepped forward, voice firm and unyielding. "Stop!" The man froze, eyes wide with shock. "How did you—" "No time for explanations," Sarah said. "You're under arrest." The saboteur lunged, but Sarah was faster. Years of combat and training gave her the edge. She disarmed him swiftly, restraining him with practiced ease. As soldiers arrived to take the man away, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. The mission was far from over, but the immediate threat was contained. Later, standing beneath the harsh lights of the base, she looked out over the planes and vehicles, symbols of strength and sacrifice. She thought of the convoy in her hometown, the president's visit, and the fragile bond with her father. This mission was more than a battle against sabotage. It was a test of her resolve, her courage, and her ability to trust again. A message came through her radio. "Operation successful. Await further instructions." Sarah exhaled, the tension easing but not disappearing. She knew this was only the beginning. The shadows held more secrets, and the war was far from over. But for now, she had made a difference. And in the silence between missions, that was enough. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Sarah stood tall, ready for whatever came next. The quiet mechanic from a small town had become a guardian of secrets, a fixer of broken things, and a soldier in a world that never stopped fighting. Her story was no longer just about silence. It was about courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to be invisible. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the base as Sarah stood alone, watching the last light fade. The mission was over, but the weight of what she had faced pressed down on her like the desert heat she once knew too well. The sabotage plot had been stopped, the mole caught, but the scars ran deeper than the surface damage to the fuel lines. She thought about the friends lost in past wars, the whispered names, the empty bunks, the promises made and broken. The medals and ceremonies were hollow without their faces beside hers. Now, standing on foreign soil, far from the quiet town that raised her, Sarah felt the true cost of service, the isolation, the silent battles that no one saw. Her phone vibrated, a message from her father. "Proud of you, Sarah. You carry the family name with honor." It was brief, but for Sarah, it was everything. The walls her father had built over decades were finally crumbling, and in that moment, she realized she wasn't just fixing machines, she was repairing broken bonds. The next days were a whirlwind of debriefings and preparations to return home. Yet Sarah's mind was restless. She had glimpsed the fragile thread that connected duty and family, sacrifice and recognition. The mission had tested her limits, but it had also opened a door she thought was forever closed. Back in her hometown, the world seemed smaller, quieter, but nothing would ever be the same. The news of her role in preventing the sabotage had spread quickly. Neighbors she barely knew offered nods of respect. The once unnoticed mechanic was now a symbol of courage and resilience. At the local community center, a ceremony was arranged. Friends, family, and townspeople gathered, faces full of pride and gratitude. Sarah stood before them, the weight of years on her shoulders, but the fire of purpose in her eyes. When the mayor presented her with a Medal of Valor, the applause was thunderous, not just for the mission, but for the woman who had always worked in silence. Her father stood nearby, his posture relaxed, the distance between them shrinking. After the ceremony, he approached her, his voice soft. "You taught me what true strength looks like." Sarah smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "We both learned." In the weeks that followed, Sarah returned to her garage, the familiar smells and sounds grounding her. Yet she knew this chapter was just one of many. The world was changing, and so was she. The quiet life she once sought now included a new mission, sharing her story, mentoring young women in the military, and honoring the sacrifices often hidden behind headlines. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The journey from silence to recognition had been long and arduous, filled with battles both external and internal. But in that stillness, she found peace. Her hands, once scarred and calloused from fixing machines, now held a legacy of courage and hope. The stories of women like her, the soldiers, pilots, medics, daughters of generals, were no longer whispers in the wind but a chorus of strength and sacrifice. And as the night deepened, Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The engines she repaired would keep flying. The secrets she uncovered would protect lives, and her story would inspire those who came after. She was no longer just the woman who fixed cars in silence. She was a hero in her own right, strong, unyielding, and ready to face whatever the future held.